Everyone, and welcome to our first session of our earlier Middle Ages seminar in this kind of a global IHR that we are enjoying at the moment. It's an immense pleasure to have Eduardo Manzano Moreno with us. I have to say, he probably doesn't remember this, but he came to give a paper many years ago in Rome when I was sort of a PhD student, and on frontier and Al-Andalus, and he was already a very celebrated and amazing historian. And then I realized that he's only a few years older than I am, and so I realized then that I had to sort of get a move on. And so it's for me an immense pleasure. He's famous for his work on frontier, the formation of Al-Andalus, his work on social uses of memory in Spain, really important work on how power uses memory. And he's was supposed to be at St. Andrews at the moment, but he's still in Spain, although he could pretend to be in St. Andrews. And so we really start with a bang, our seminar. It will be a difficult act to follow because the topic is really exciting, and I can't imagine anyone better than he to do something so ambitious and so interesting this evening. And the title is it possible to write a global history of the Middle Ages? Eduardo, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you very much to Alice Rio and to the Institute of Historical Research for having invited me to this wonderful series of seminars. And it's wonderful to see so many colleagues and friends who are just virtual across the screen, and to see that they are keeping healthy and they're keeping fine. And hello to everyone. It's really nice to see you there, and it's a big pleasure. Now, well, basically, the title of my talk includes a pretty straightforward question on the possibility of writing a global history of the Middle Ages. And I think I'm going to break the rules of any well-structured talk by giving also a very straightforward answer to this question at the very beginning, instead of doing so at the end of the seminar. As a matter of fact, in the next minutes, I'm going to try to set a number of arguments that explain why I think that it is not really possible to write a global history of the Middle Ages at this moment. And I would like to also say why there are a number of reasons that do not allow us at this moment to write a global history of the Middle Ages. But having said so, I will also try to show why we need to encourage long-term agendas with an increasing global perspective, as I'm really convinced that the current social and cultural landscape is changing very rapidly, and that there are enough signs that medieval studies might confront a number of difficult challenges in the near future. So my talk will be divided in two parts that will present both sides of the same coin. And I will end with a number of possible case studies that we are just following at this moment at St. Andrews that might provide some examples on how we can make this coin roll across some interesting paths. As I have just stated, I think that from a general point of view, and despite of the fact that some excellent and recent contributions have been made on the theoretical problems which pose this issue, at this moment, I think it is not possible to speak of a proper global Middle Ages as a recognizable historiographical trend or field with scholarly landmarks that might serve as a reference works for further research. We are not simply still there. The very notion of global Middle Ages can spark, in fact, some very severe and serious criticisms. Global, in the first place, is a term that resonates with the idea of present-day economic globalization, which again raises a number of well-argued rejections on its own rights. It is also a term that demands a worldwide approach that should include the Americas and Oceania, whose history at this period lacked the slightest connection with how the field of medieval studies is conceived. And also, finally, to speak of the Middle Ages in regions different from Europe, where this term was coined, may draw obvious allegations of Eurocentrism. So yes, it is fair to say that from this point of view, the global Middle Ages looks very much like one of those grounded rockets that, notwithstanding how flashy they look, they just fail to take off after ignition. Now, if you allow me to follow with this metaphor, I would say that present weather conditions for the launching of these rockets do not look particularly good either. 7 months of pandemic have already taught us that the economic, social, and political shortcomings that were already there, that were already in place before the crisis, have only increased as a result of the extraordinary conditions we are living now. Among many other things, we have witnessed local, regional, or national responses ferociously competing among themselves, and thus turning upside down the famous model that urged people to think globally and act locally. As a matter of fact, the pandemic has certainly acted globally, but people have tended to think locally. Now, this local thinking, however, was still there before the pandemic. The ideas encapsulated in the America First slogan, or in the arguments used by supporters of Brexit, no matter how much one may disagree with them, are clear indicators of deep social reactions against the new economic, political, and cultural frameworks that were fostered by the unprecedented growth of interconnections, migrations, and transfers of financial and also symbolic capitals on a global scale. So it is a puzzling paradox that these reactions have emerged from two leading countries of the Anglosphere, the United Kingdom and the US, which were considered to be among the main winners of these new conditions back in the 90s. The situation that I have just briefly outlined, and I don't pretend to have made a comprehensive or even workable outline of the very complex situation we're living today, but just might resonate with you some bells that we may have in common. But this situation that I have just briefly outlined is having a tremendous impact on our discipline, perhaps more than what we are ready to accept. I cannot really elaborate on this complex issue here, but I would like to point out two different outcomes of the current atmosphere that face the case or hinder the case for global understanding of the past. The first is the growing trend to consider historical memory as a crucial element for building national, ethnic, or gender identities. I would suggest that this trend fosters an emotional, community-based relation with the past that is affecting historical conceptions in a deep and a very complex way. I think I am not the only professional historian who is puzzled and to some extent baffled whenever I am confronted by conceptions that consider history as not really worth engaging unless it brings a sense of pride and belonging to a given community. And you can define this community by any means, or with any specific objective. It was interesting that this week, following a number of statements in the same line, the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has stood against the historical criticisms of the colonial past by proclaiming that we, meaning the British, are proud of this country's culture, history, and traditions. And this is just the exact words that he used. And if you allow me, I could not help remembering an episode I had a couple of years ago when I was in Seville in a taxi with an acquaintance. This was a year ago, as I said. And during the taxi ride, I was dismissing in very strong terms recent revisionist views that have become very popular in this country and that are attempting to reverse the description of the Spanish Empire, as you know, as a dark period with, you know, a brutal colonization of the Americas and so on. So there's a big revision of these ideas today in Spain, and has become very popular about, you know, the whole ideas of the Spanish imperial past. So I was very, you know, I was criticizing these revisionist views in very strong terms. Now, I was talking with my acquaintance in the taxi, and the taxi rider remained silent throughout the long ride. But when we arrived to destination, the taxi said to me, I do think you're right, sir, but still we badly need to feel proud of ourselves and of our past. Otherwise, we are left with nothing. So this is point and game for Boris Johnson, and I am defeated here in this particular aspect. So curiously enough, this notion that the past is a closed mirror that reflects a communal identity is becoming a global trend. The great Indian historian Romila Thapar and other distinguished historians from this country have been staunch critics of the partisan interpretation of Indian history, which claims a monolithic and dominant Hindi historical identity against the Muslim community and Muslim minority. This is an historical interpretation that has been promoted in recent years by the Bharatiya Janata Party, now in government. Now, this is something that is taking place in Britain, it's taking place in Spain, it's taking place in the US, it's taking place also in places like India, but it's also taking place in other parts of the world. As you will remember, in the late 70s, Edward Said produced a wonderful, unnecessary, and unavoidable critique of Orientalism, which you know, gave way to a myriad of works that dealt with this issue about Orientalism, which have really transformed our perception of how we confront the Orient. However, this great work by Edward Said has also had a side effect, which is the reinforcement of essentialist notions on history in Arab and Islamic countries. And this is something that the late Syrian thinker, Sadiq Jalal al-Azm, anticipated when he coined the term reverse Orientalism, meaning, you know, an Orientalism that was produced, a trend that was produced in Arab and Islamic countries, which were using the same essentialist notions to confront what they saw as the threat of Western ideas. In the case of China, I'm not a specialist and I'm not familiar with the bibliography, but I have taken the words of Professor Chen Wang, who has recently written a book on memory and history, and historical memory and politics. He claims, and I am quoting him verbatim, he claims that historical consciousness in China, especially people's pride over its ancient civilization, which is a chosen glory, and their collective memory about the 100 years of humiliation, which is the chosen trauma, have greatly contributed to shaping the Chinese national identity. So, all in all, what we find here is that is a call to try to find ourselves in the deeds and the words of the ancestors. And so if this is just the set of how historical writing, of how historical conceptions should be, there is no need to call the others into the picture. There's no need to be global. There is no need to try to feel proud of ourselves, proud of our past, because there's no need to call the history of China or the history of Britain or whatever. You want to be proud of the Spanish history. To put it in the words of Duncan Smith, and so I'm quoting him verbatim, as identity is challenged, undermined, or possibly shattered, so memories are drawn on and reshaped to defend unity and coherence, to shore up a sense of self and community. So we are witnessing, my point here is that what we are witnessing is that there is a global, interestingly, a global trend towards historical perceptions that emphasize identities, that emphasize community belonging, that emphasize that the past is kind of a mirror or of a provider of of identity marks that are useful for our days. But that outside this conception, there is nothing particularly that the history can offer to us. And this is something that, as I said, is a very interesting trend. It's a global trend, and it's worth examining here. It would be worth examining much more in much more detail than what I have been able to do here right now. Now, I have mentioned that this is the current atmosphere is affecting in this way, in two ways. One was this one that I have just mentioned. And there is also another way in which I think the current situation is affecting in negative terms the idea of global Middle Ages. And this one derives from my own experience, so you will have to bear with me for providing a very personal view of some issues that are affecting the field of medieval studies. So there is no scholarly mentions here, no quotes or anything. It's just my personal experience, what I'm going to try to convey to you. As I mentioned before, and despite the current situation, we have been living in the last 20 or 30 years, a kind of sort of golden age in terms of internationalization of the discipline of the medieval studies. There have never been before so many conferences, projects, and seminars with so many participants from so many different national backgrounds. Arguably, the field has become much more international than it had been before. This does not mean necessarily that the field has become more diverse, but this is an issue that I will address when dealing with the other side of my coin. But for the sake of the argument, what I want to stress here is the relative high degree of globalization, so to speak, that the discipline has undergone in recent times. However, and as it is usually the case with globalization, this has produced some paradoxical and not very welcome effects in some cases. Perhaps a very superficial, and if you want, just self-evident effect of all this is the increasing prevalence of English as the dominant language of scientific communication. This is something that English speakers are not always aware of, but the linguistic barrier can be an unsurmountable barrier for many scholars whose language skills in English are either very limited or even non-existent. In these cases, and no matter how interesting, how relevant their work might be, it is really difficult for them to convey the results of their work to wider audiences other than those that speak the same language. Widespread use of English has also entailed that secondary literature, which is quoted in scholarly works written in English, has tended to diminish references in languages like French, Spanish, Italian, German, or Catalan in the last few decades. So please, I want to make clear, please do not take this comment personally, as I am sure that most of you, if not all of you, quote multilingual references. The point I'm trying to make here is that there is a growing tendency to consider works published or delivered in English as the main scholarly reference, whereas other vernacular languages are rapidly losing their status as means of scientific communication. This is something that I know particularly from sitting in many different panels, researching, evaluating research projects, or research assessment exercises that we also undertake here in Spain, as you do in Britain, and also undertake in Italy and in France. And in all these cases, usually, it is conferred more value to works published in English because it is assumed that their peer-reviewed contents attract the interest of wider audiences. This is very reasonable, and you are talking with someone who is already convinced by that. But as I have just said, not everyone can write in English, and translations of scholarly works are difficult and are always expensive. So colleagues who bitterly complain about the lack of appreciation of their otherwise excellent work because it has been published in Spanish or any other language, or any language other than English, tend to shrug off the global approach to the discipline because they consider it as no more than a fashionable historiographical trend whose packaging is brighter than its contents, and which badly compares with the tiresome and painstaking process of analyzing empirical and specific evidence. So there is this gap already there that the quest for a global history on a wider scale would make just more difficult to reach. It's also interesting, and this is something that I can tell you, perhaps again, coming from a country like Spain, it's also worth noting in passing that in the same way as globalization is destroying small businesses and small companies and so on, because the delocalization processes and so on, the scholarly publications with regional or even national impact in countries like Spain are finding increasing difficulties to survive. And the reason for this is because, first of all, young scholars are changing their publication strategies, because when they publish in these regional or local periodicals, or when they publish in when they publish a book with a local publisher and so on, when they come to a research assessment, they are usually, these outputs are not usually very well received. No, they are not appreciated. Whereas if someone comes with a book from a prestigious publisher elsewhere, particularly in the States or in the UK, their publication record will be much more appreciated. So these regional publications, local publications, and so, or even in some cases national publications, are having many difficulties to survive because also of funding, and also because the lack of new materials to publicize. So it's understandable that there are critics of the global Middle Ages, because they have a point where they claim that the very nature of the historian's subjects is usually local and specific in comparison to those which are dealt with in other scientific disciplines. A cell is a cell here and in China, but the startling variety of social, economic, cultural, or political conditions in different latitudes always defies comprehensive analysis and interpretations. So history happens everywhere and to everyone, but it takes a different shape in every place and in every mind. So certainly the tension between localism and universalism, between subjectivity and objectivity, is always a challenging issue when we deal with historical processes, and it has been pointed out countless times. There is another problem for the global Middle Ages, and this is the set of references, the framework that we historians assume. Again, this is a well-known fact that the study of the Middle Ages emerged within the framework of national historiographies, which were keen to find in this period the origins of nations, institutions, or beliefs. Although during the second half of the 20th century, this bias was mitigated by the emergence of social history and cultural studies, we all know that the nation paradigm still tends to dominate the scene. Again, this is a trend that perhaps is not so remarkable in the Americas or even in the UK, where powerful academic institutions can afford to house a great variety of topics and fields. But in continental Europe, and particularly in the poorer parts of continental Europe, a Spanish historian is likely to study Spanish medieval history. And I don't think I know any case of a Spanish historian who works on English medieval history. And so if that's not the case, you can imagine how difficult it would be for a historian who works on Spanish medieval history to have a more global perspective. An Italian medievalist is more likely to become a specialist on the city of Pisa rather than on the Hanseatic trade. So yes, the national framework has molded the perceptions of generations of medievalists, and I think it is just wishful thinking to pretend that this will change overnight. So in the first half an hour, more or less, I have been making the case against the global Middle Ages by mentioning a number of specific and structural aspects that explain why we are still not in a position to write a consistent and high quality global history of the Middle Ages. In other words, the rocket I mentioned before cannot be launched with enough guarantees. It might just explode. However, all this does not mean that because we are facing real problems, we should give up the exploration of a new and exciting field that might offer to future generations not only a better understanding of the past, but also a better understanding of the present. Now, let me go back to what I think history should be. And I don't think that history should be a provider of emotional bonds with or links with the ancestors. I am totally convinced that we have not existed in the past. I am totally against the idea of making the past visible to the present by telling people, look, they lived like us. I don't agree with this view. I strongly disagree with this view. We can discuss about it, but I think it's a wrong perception of history, and it doesn't really help to make it more available to a general public, although I know that there are very distinguished colleagues who will think otherwise. I do think that history is a source of knowledge because history is far away from us. History is works more or less like astronomy in the sense that we are looking at distant past. We know we will never be there, but we have to analyze a distant past, which is existent with or without us, which is existent without us. We are the outcomes of this past, very much like astronomy is showing us, but we are not, but the universe will exist without us. There is no doubt about that. And I consider that whenever we try to make history something which is providing us with identities, historians stop being historians and they become astrologists. So history is a source of knowledge, which is the prerequisite for the transformation of the social world, of society. When we know and we understand reality, we are better equipped to change reality. And this is why I think we need to challenge the widespread notion, which is shared by many, many scholars, who consider the aim of humanities in general and of history in particular as the production of knowledge that is justified by itself. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Under this perspective, our work as historians is deemed as a collective endeavor that accumulates materials, data, and interpretations into a gigantic encyclopedia of learning, driven by intellectual passion and a desire to enhance the individual's education. Is this way research outputs are perceived as circular or recurrent, which is what mainly the Greek word enklikios enkyklios means. And from this perspective, the only aim of history is to produce and make available materials for the education of citizens, the paideia, the famous paideia. So I think that there are many reasons to challenge this view and to suggest that knowledge in humanities in general, and in history in particular, can be and should be innovative, transforming, and definitely non-circular. Again, I cannot elaborate on this here, but I think it is worth considering, for instance, the enormous impact that conceptions and interpretations elaborated by social sciences, by social and human sciences do have on societies. And as it has been the case, for instance, by the case of gender studies, which have been going on for at least 3 decades, if not more, and whose results are encouraging the crucial social trends that we are witnessing these days. At a more pedestrian level, the innovative character of historical knowledge is also demonstrated by the extraordinary progress of the discipline in the last 100 years, to the extent that today we simply know much more history than our forebears, no matter how excellent scholars they were. This is the result of an unprecedented advance in the understanding of textual sources, archaeological remains, artistic expressions, and not to mention the increasingly sophisticated conceptual tools that allow us to make better sense of the discrete pieces of evidence that make up the historical records. So my point here is that history, far from being encyclopedic, is like biology or astronomy, a discipline prone to steady advance, a discipline which is always under permanent construction, as the great Marxist French historian Pierre Villard once suggested. So, as a source of relevant knowledge with an inescapable social dimension, which needs to act, needs to transform society, we should try to overcome the difficulties of the present that I have just mentioned. And I think that one of the ways, it's not the only way, but one of the ways in doing so is to try to produce what the French would call le tournant global, the global term. Now, it's clear that this tournant global, this global term, is much more possible nowadays than it was 20 or 30 or 30 years ago. We have many more dots that can be connected at this moment that were not possible to connect. And this has been thanks to the phenomenal growth of knowledge in the last decades. So this is why I think that the global perspective could give us a more comprehensive view or more comprehensive knowledge than the knowledge that we have been having until now. So this is the first step that I think should lead us to consider the global Middle Ages. But before getting to some examples that might help to understand what I'm trying to say, I think it's very important to mention the fact that in recent years, this maturity that the field has achieved has been demonstrated in several edited books on global history by Maxim Berg, Belig, Darwin, and Wickham, the excellent book, the excellent past and present volume by Holmes and Naomi Standen. And from these discussions, it emerges the idea that we can make connections that certainly involve movements of people, goods, techniques, and ideas, networks of exchange, trade relations, hostilities, and all sorts of material and immaterial links that we are able to trace. But not only we can trace connections, it is also interesting when we cannot trace connections, because this is the fundamental aspect that needs to be discussed also in global history. Global history is not only about connections, it is also about the lack of connections. Also, connections from a global perspective, making connections in a global perspective also involves comparison. Now, comparison is not an end on itself, but rather a heuristic tool that allows us to define a certain set of well-defined conditions and elements in order to assess their variability at different but relatable contexts. As a heuristic tool, comparison helps us to identify common conditions and elements of particular contexts, make relevant questions on them, and gain a deeper knowledge. In these connections, we are managing to make better comparisons as we are becoming aware that it is generally better to start with elements rather than wholes, as the different structurations give a more immediate idea of difference. And we have excellent examples of books which have been written recently from this perspective, and you all know all of them, or many of them, which have been written in the last years, and that I think they provide an excellent point of departure to this gigantic task that is awaiting for us. Claudia Rapp mentioned once in a seminar that comparison is perhaps the best tools in the hands of historians to bridge the gap between the local and the universal. So let me just let me just recap for a moment. First of all, what brings us to the global history as a possibility to face the challenges that humanities in general and history in particular are facing nowadays. First of all, we should depart from the idea of history as an innovative discipline, an idea which has had an incredible development in the last 30, 40 years. We are at a crossroads, really crossroads, a very, very, very important crossroads, historical crossroads, at which we need to set new agendas in order to understand the counterintuitive elements of the past. We also need to concentrate on connections, and we need to be aware of the fact that we have a number of heuristic tools that are available but are not compulsory. And this is something that I think is important, particularly for students. The idea is that no matter how specific and specialized a given research topic is, it should be possible to insert it into a global framework of reference. And this is something for me very important, because I just want to dispose of the idea that there is this total contradiction between, a specific empirical hard work, medieval history, and this global, out of the ground, totally baseless global framework of reference. There are ways in which we should try to connect it. This is not easy. This is an uncharted territory, but I think that the eminent sinologist Hilde de Beert has nicely put it when she says that building up from local expertise, identifying themes, questions, and sources from regional historiography, but also to see how they can be connected with issues that can be identified in a global framework. So and this is for me very important, because we can proceed now from a bottom-up perspective, instead of what the historical sociology of the 80s was proposing. Nowadays, I think that from the field of medieval studies, we can advance in a bottom-up perspective. Now, it is also true, and I would accept criticisms, that global history is not entirely satisfactory, and it has obvious shortcomings, but it's a term that we are bound to use due to the fact that other possible alternatives like world history, international history, are even less suitable to describe this historiographical trend. So it is sheer pragmatism. And the same happens with the idea of the Middle Ages. I know that this entails endless discussions about whether it's appropriate to use Middle Ages for other parts, because it's an ideological loaded concept which was crafted in Western Europe, and so on and so on. So, but look, I work on Islamic Spain, and there is no way to refer to Al-Andalus unless other than it is a medieval society. And there is no way to refer to the rest of Dar al-Islam as a medieval society. although obviously for Islam, in Islamic terms, chronology, I mean, the Middle Ages are not obviously the Middle Ages, are just the formative ages. But I think that Middle Ages is just a concept that we are using without any other, without any other, bias, in the same way that we are using chronology, which begins with the birth of Jesus Christ, and that doesn't mean that we are Christians. And in the same way as the physics, uses the term atom, which obviously it is a wrong term, because atom means something that cannot be divided, and we all know nowadays that the atoms can be divided. So there's no one in physics has tried to tell people that we should abandon the concept of atom, because just a handy concept. Now, based on, I'm just finishing, and based on this based on these ideas, I am right now conducting a research project at the University of St. Andrews, a research project which has been funded by the British Academy, which will run for 4 years, but we'll see how the pandemic is going to affect it. And we are not trying to produce a global history of the Middle Ages, but we are trying to lay down the foundations of global Middle Ages. This is a multi-year task that will require a lot of efforts. We are not addressing the whole Middle Ages. We are concentrating on a number of topics, just 4 topics, and we are trying to run a number of seminars and a number of activities related to all these topics. And I just wanted to discuss just one particular topic, very briefly, because I thought it might be interesting for you. This is a work in progress. Professor Alice Rio told me that part of this seminar was to discuss current work. So this is very preliminary, so take it with a grain of salt. But it is a topic that we want to address because we think it's extremely interesting. This is one of the things that we would like to deal with from a global, from the perspective of the global Middle Ages, is what happens in this period, because Middle Ages, as I said, is in this period in different parts of the world, with the idea of bad government. Bad government, which we consider as, the perception and the practice of government which doesn't follow a number of, which is considered to be evil, which is considered not to adjust to a number of legal or moral rulings. Now, this is, for me, this is something interesting because within the classical tradition, the idea of bad government is usually traced back to Plato, who deemed lawful government as good and lawless government as bad. And now Aristotle came all over the way and refined Plato's by incorporating the notion of interest, with the results that bad government became the exercise in the interest of the rulers, and good government the use of power in the interest of the rules. Now, there is some interesting medieval elaborations of these concepts in the West by Thomas Aquinas, who they identified with the common good, and also the Western canon of political theory, where law had a different role depending on whether it was enforced by power in order to bring the common good, or whether it was conceived as a limitation of power. So these are really fascinating issues that I just wanted to look. Now, there is this common perception among medievalists that these ideas just more or less put the foundations of the political development that, went from medieval times to Boris Johnson nowadays and the democratic regimes that we are having nowadays. So this is like kind of a teleological conception that is very much ingrained in our perception of the historical developments in the West. And I wanted to look at this idea of bad government from a different perspective, from the Islamic point of view. And from the Islamic point of view, bad government, one of the interesting things about, first of all, about governments and institutions is that most of medieval Islamic institutions were not tainted by the idea of Oriental despotism, as is the common perception. If you ask any student perhaps, and you ask who is not familiar with Islamic societies in the Middle Ages, he or she will say, well, these are despotic societies with a ruler with absolute power and so on and so on. Now, the big surprise is that this is far from this. When one analyzes this, it is very, very far from being the case. The most medieval Islamic institutions held a legitimacy that was based on something that is incredibly interesting: the moral authority conferred by the Muslim community. This has made me revise the ideas that I used to have on Oriental despotism, because the community, or the Ummah, played throughout the whole Middle Ages a more conspicuous role in the political articulation of society that has been hitherto recognized. In contrast, those institutions that were not based on the moral authority emanating from the Muslim community always had a deficit of legitimacy and were considered illegitimate, or even tyranny. And this is extremely interesting, because tyranny, when you look at the concept of tyranny in Islamic societies, the term tyranny derives from the root tawa, which is the excess of injustice or impiety, which is exactly the opposite of Sharia, which is the religiously inspired law. So in the eyes of Muslim writers, bad government was linked to religious infidelity, which was conceived not so much in terms of belief, but of legal observance. So this is something that obliges us to look in a different perspective to this problem of the Oriental despotism. And I want just to finish with this, the nail on this, or the fascinating thing about this, is that this general framework that I have just briefly described, because as I said, this is a work in progress, is confirmed when you analyze Arab chronicles from the 10th century in Cordoba. And in the 10th century in Cordoba, there is a mention to the concept of maslaha. Now, maslaha is the benefit, is welfare. Actually, nowadays, Muslim scholars refer to maslaha to refer to welfare. But the interesting thing is that in 10th century Cordoba, the Caliph, the Umayyad Caliph of Cordoba, was doing a number of things, a number of constructions, a number of distributions of money to the poor, and a number of acts that are recorded by chroniclers, because he wanted to bestow benefit, maslaha, to his subjects. So the interesting thing is that there is, as early as the 10th century, there is a conception in Cordoba of what a good government should be and what a bad government should be. Now, we are far away here from the generalizations of the Oriental despotism. We are very far here from the usually, cliches that many times are just put on front of societies that are not Western societies. We are looking at a very fascinating and complex political theory that only will emerge as a result of, as I said, comparisons, connections, and the excellent theoretical framework that we have developed in the last decades. So this is why that the role whose both sides I have tried to describe in this talk, I think that it can grow in the future, and we will be able to produce, not just now, but just in the future, we will be able to build a global history of the Middle Ages. Well, thank you.
I'm trying to unmute myself. Amazing, really, really. Oh, I can see some very technological colleagues. I mean, I just did it manually rather than. Eduardo, it was really fascinating. I hope that the chat function will be working, okay, that I will make it work properly. I'm sure that it will be flooded, but if I just can abuse my chair kind of sort of privileges, just to ask the first question, which is a very naive one, because I really don't have. I was wondering, do you think that the term global itself is something that also changes over time and is subject to historical processes of interpretation? I mean, I did my PhD in Pisa, Turin, and Bologna, and if you ask someone from Pisa, a medievalist from Pisa, for them, Pisa is global history. Pisa is the entire world, and I'm sure that for someone who was working in the, I don't know, 19 or first half of the 20th century, studying the West, that was global history, because or for Duby, the Middle Ages, where, you know, that little bit of France and the rest was just sort of kind of deviation from a model that actually should have worked everywhere. So what I was wondering is, what is your idea of global now? What is now for you in this moment global? How global it is? What do you mean with, or what do we mean with global now?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, and this is something that I didn't have time to address. Well, mainly at this again in this gradual approach that I'm suggesting, I would try to say that global is Eurasian and Africa. I don't think we are ready right now to have the Americas and Oceania into this conversation. So perhaps one way of saying is it's a wonderful definition, or best term, that was coined by a PhD student whose name I cannot remember because he dropped his PhD, but he spoke of hemispherical history, which I think is a great concept. I very much like hemispherical history, including, as I said, Europe, Africa, and Asia. So yes, basically what I think is global in the Middle Ages would mean all the societies which can have a history, which can, no, it's not a good definition, is all the societies that can be somehow connected or interpreted within a common framework of interpretation, right? Or can be connected. Now, obviously, this is an incredible task, because, you know, there are so many different societies and so on. Also, the my chronological framework would also stop by the 13th century, because I think that from the 14th century onwards, there is a new there are new dynamics. So we are basically concentrating on a period from the, say, 5th, 6th centuries to the 13th centuries, which is the period in which still there are not these, you know, these clear routes of trade routes and connections and so on. So the interesting thing is, at this point, I would say global or hemispheric history, which is really a very nice term. Could try to make the connections that we have not been able to make, and we'll also try to make to highlight those connections that cannot be made. And from this point of view, it is important to say that we are not seeking just to try to draw maps with lines and and contacts and so on. We are also trying to explain why some contacts do not take place, why some things do not just flow as they should have flown. We should try to also, global history should try to also be, hemispheric history should also try to be more inclusive. And this is something which is part of the discussion, of the conversation. We should really open the field of medieval studies to a more diverse audience, to more diverse actors too. And yeah, so somehow I envisage it's a kind of renewal of the research agenda, which tries to get, to capitalize on the great achievements that we have had in the past, but which tries to put it into another dimension. I do not know if I have made myself clear.
Thank you, Eduardo.